fine line between strengthening our research from this tool versus saturating it is something we might struggle with. In order to effectively utilize this tool to bring out our best voice, we will then be turning to Dr. Iftikhar, who will go over his reflections on the matter. After a thorough discussion, we will then turn to our research students, who will critically reflect on the discussed points and briefly present their work. This way, we are hoping to make the session a two-way interaction and strive for as much engagement as possible. According to Charles Kettering, research means that you don't know, but you are willing to find out. It is through this spirit that we venture onwards in translating our thoughts into actions and prose into practice, as there is no research without action and no action without research. We hope this session hones your creativity and cultivates your curiosity to amplify your vision for your respective projects. Without further ado, I will now hand it over to Dr. Bates. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. मुझे बहुत खुशी है कि आप सभी ने मुझे मौका मिला और मैं दावत के लिए बहुत शुक्रगुजार हूँ। इसलिए तो मैं सोचा हूँ कि अभी हमारा डिस्कशन इससे कुछ कोई फ़ायदा ना फ़ायदा होगा आपके लिए और मेरे लिए भी ज़रूर। So what I'm briefly will be discussing with you is something what I normally call the 5 points I keep in a sense boringly repeating to students whom I'm engaging with about writing. And I would argue these 5 points would be good to consider, most of which you probably already know, not only writing a dissertation or a proposal, but even a research article or for that matter even a book in the academic context. Of course, the first point of that is the research question. The research question is already a challenge that it has to be not very general, not very vague, but here comes the catch, it has to have a use value. That means you have to find an aspect that has not been discussed before. So you cannot just go by any emotional or activist or whatever leaning. You have to go by a particular curiosity, or more precisely, you have to go by a particular lack of knowledge, by a particular gap that exists. The second point that I normally mention in this case is the conceptual discourse reference. So when you are discussing a certain issue and inquiring, you have to know what is the angle and what is the concept under which you want to analyze it. Because every data, every issue can have so many different competing perspectives. So even if you're, I don't know, looking at structure, what means structure? The other day we were talking about political Islam. What is political? Political is not just fighting, political is not just control, it's not just government, it's also governance and a lot of other issues that are involved. Similarly, Islam. Since these terms cannot be reduced to one meaning, you have to find that particular meaning that you want to inquire about, and preferably in the process need to give your own definition of it. That is, what is your take on that particular concept? Of course, if this concept is going to have any sort of relevance or weight, you need to prove that. So how do you prove it? You prove it by referring to the conceptual discussion, the discourse that is happening in international academia. And here it is important that you go beyond the South Asian, both arguments and writings. Because today we are living in a global world with not only connectivity, but academia, intellectually speaking, is a global dimension. And if we are kind of struggling or fighting for bridging a gap between the so-called global south and the global global north. To make the academic discourse global, it is important that you also engage with this global discourse and that you engage with the terms and the books written in this connection. And you have to check where your arguments fits in and what is new about it when you then give your take on the matter. The third point in this connection is the data. And again, the question is, how and where would be data which would be new, which have not been collected or have not been used or analyzed before? Are you aware of that? Can you find that out? And also, of course, when you're having a project like 2, 3, 4-year project, you have to prove that they are accessible, and they are accessible during the time of your project. So you cannot just say, maybe something is here and something is there, and then maybe I go and then maybe I check, and then endlessly you would be traveling around. I mean, of course, there are always people who are doing their PhD in 10 and 20 years, but maybe you don't want to join that group. So that is, of course, surely a challenge. Then comes the research methodology in the narrow sense of the word. That is how you want to analyze that. And here it depends on the field where you are, particular field and discipline on this subject. And finally, the fifth point that in that connection is extremely valid, to answer your research question. That seems to be obvious and evident and clear, but unfortunately not everyone is answering the research question, because at the end you have to answer the same question that you asked in the beginning. And you cannot just make a general statement about something you found or about something you were reading about, but you have to precisely address exactly the same question that you asked in the beginning. And what can help you in the process is giving a brief one-sentence or one-para summary at the end of every chapter. How and in what way it contributed to answering the research question. In addition, what else may be relevant in the process of writing? It is, of course, also communication. That means people should not fall asleep while reading your dissertation. So, how you do that without blabbering into journalism or activism. So you can bring in experience from the field, for instance. You can bring in key notes or key data of key actors, key institutions, whatever was there in terms of a concrete element that you would be dealing with and how they relate to your research. Another issue that is also important and often underestimated is the role of discipline. Because if you, for instance, aiming at going to do a certain research, let's say in the context of Europe or in the United States, the political, the discipline plays an important role, because in many universities, actually more in continental Europe than in the Anglo-Saxon world, the Viva process, that is the defense process, is held in a particular department. And that particular department has a particular orientation. And you will willy-nilly have to engage with the orientation of that particular department where your Viva will be held. Of course, it is always possible to have interdisciplinary inquiries, but interdisciplinary should not mean that you are not clearly reflecting expecting that you know about a particular disciplinary background. For instance, if you are coming, as I'm doing, from political science, but you're inquiring into religious actors or into historical development, if you are bringing in interdisciplinary context, then in the beginning it would always be helpful if you make that clear. Because you should actually say that very clearly, directly in the beginning, in your introduction. Look, I'm going to look at these data from this particular perspective, but from this and this angle, I will also bring in this political science subject, I will bring in Islamic studies with this particular angle, and I will bring in history with this particular angle, and clearly refer to a particular literature that is representing the takes you are looking for. And when in all the scramble of all these knowledge and theory and concepts, you appear to be lost, then try to define your particular take on it, because that will help the reader to understand where you're coming from. So let's say if you are going for governance in the form of claims made by Muslim actors, then you have to define what is your understanding of governance in this context in 1 or 2 sentences, so that it becomes clear for the reader by what standard your writing should be measured. And if you are doing field work, of course, there is always, not only today, but actually always, a question of ethics that is involved. Ethics in terms of data, to what extent you are respecting people's rights, that you are dealing with, to what extent you're getting their consent for sharing their data or for using their data. And when you are doing field work, research, and quoting the data in your writing, at least in our context, even if the interview partners want to stay anonymous, you are always required as a minimum reference to give the time and to give the date and location where you interviewed that particular person, so that a certain relevance and reliability and plausibility is still required. And in many contexts, actually, you may face questions and challenges later to what extent that is based on facts, because some universities have had some issues and some conflicts over such issues, so there must be data in your repository where you could prove later on inquiries that this interview was actually done with this and this person, released in a confidential context. Equally important, of course, is a consistent and complete reference system. I always plead in favor of the Chicago system, which is the easiest, I think, and the simplest. So it would be a good advice to strictly follow a particular system right from the beginning. And of course, I mean, plagiarism or no quotes without referencing is an enormously important element, since actually there exists nowadays a lot of digital formats that can automatically check if your dissertation has any quotes that have not been referenced. And mind you, at least in the German context, a couple of politicians, including ministers, had to step down over their PhDs being boasted and blasted for plagiarism. So far from my side, and I'll hand it over to Iftikhar Malik. Thank you.